Well, hello, friends. I wanted to begin our study of Colossians 3 today at the place that's very special to me, the historic Oxford Cemetery. Some we call it St. Peter's Cemetery. And, you know, a cemetery is a reminder of something that's over. Cemetery is made necessary by death. And so as we walk through the Oxford Cemetery, we see reminders of people that have lived in this part of the cemetery long before us. I've been told that cedar trees were planted in cemeteries back a century ago because people thought that might help prevent the yellow fever epidemic. And Oxford was almost closed down by a yellow fever epidemic about the turn of the 20th century, late 19th century. So now we find ourselves in another epidemic. I don't think cedar trees will help this time either, but you could always try. If you get over the hill over here, our most famous grave in the cemetery, William Faulkner, and then many of my friends and some of my family members buried over there. So frankly, it's all about death. Imagine if you had your own private cemetery, though, not an Oxford community thing, but your own private cemetery. And I don't mean a family cemetery. That was very common back a couple of generations ago, and still a few places they're family cemeteries. But I'm talking about a cemetery where you could bury some sins, because Paul, in writing this chapter 3 of Colossians, is emphasizing the change that should occur in a disciple's life and how they're to leave the old lifestyle behind and take on a new lifestyle. So he starts off and he talks about putting to death some really bad things. Sexual immorality, impurity, evil desires, greed, slander, filthy talk, lying. Wouldn't it be wonderful if you and I had our own private cemetery, cedar trees or not? And you could say, there's sexual immorality. I have put that to death in my life, and good old sexual immorality is dead and gone. It's not part of my reality anymore. And over there is lying. I used to be really bad about twisting and stretching the truth to exploit others, frankly, and to make things look better for me. But I've put that to death. That's not in my life anymore. Greed. I used to be so materialistic, unwilling to share, unwilling to show mercy to less fortunate people. But there's old greed buried there. Nice stone above greed, and goodbye greed. You're not around anymore. You're not here anymore. So this concept of a sharp break, of not just getting 90% or 99%, of having that binary condition of just getting it all the way out of our life. Is this really possible, though? What do you think? Let's talk about that some today. Let's study it as we get a little deeper into Colossians chapter 3. Well, so much for our visit to the cemetery. Before we begin to talk about your own private graveyard for some of your sins, let's go back to last week, to Colossians chapter 2 for just a minute for a review. And as I always encourage those of you who get an email about this class, if you haven't gotten your handout already, you might just pause the video here and go and get that handout printed or pulled up where you can refer to it. Because the first thing on here is a review question. Makes an important point. Last week we were diving into the analogy that Paul makes between circumcision in the Old Testament and the circumcision made without hands when we're baptized, where it cuts away this old sinful person. It says our heart is circumcised. So that's a very powerful metaphor, powerful analogy of the profound change that should occur when a person is baptized. It does occur, spiritually speaking, when a person is baptized. However, we can get really confused and pointing in the wrong direction about baptism if we push the analogy with circumcision too far, because after all, circumcision was not an expression of the faith of the infant. The infant, is not mentally developed at 8 days to, make a statement of faith one way or the other. It may be indeed, in fact, it should be a statement of faith on the part of the parents, on the part of the community, that they want this little boy to be a part of God's covenant people. So the practice, in fact, of child baptism, people point back to this Old Testament practice of circumcision and say, well, this is the circumcision under the new covenant. Little boys and little girls, we baptize them as infants, we bring them into the community, and is a statement of our faith and our desire to see them grow up inside the community. In some cases, this also gets involved in the doctrine of original sin, which we won't go into right now. However, in the New Testament, the baptism that's practiced there, it is always part and parcel a process that includes faith and repentance. And it's really clear that without faith, baptism is just getting wet. And so there are three verses that are key to this understanding of baptism. And one's the one we looked at last week, Colossians 2:12, which says, and again, we're starting in the middle of one of Paul's long sentences here, having been buried with him in baptism, in which you were also raised with him, now listen to this, through your faith in the working of God. For baptism to, in fact, be a resurrection, a spiritual resurrection, the person being baptized has to have faith in the working of God. Otherwise, they're just getting wet. In Acts 22:16, Paul's testimony about his own conversion, he talks about what Ananias, the guy that baptized him, said when he came and talked to Paul and realized that Paul was repentant, Paul was a believer. He said, what are you waiting for? Acts 22:16, get up and be baptized and wash away your sins, calling on his name. And again, the appeal, the appeal of faith to God to take your sins away has to be a part of scriptural baptism. And then finally, 1 Peter 3:21, he's comparing baptism to the deliverance that that Noah and his family had on board the ark during the great flood that we read about in the book of Genesis. This water symbolizes baptism that now saves you also. Listen to this. Not the removal of dirt from the body, but the pledge of a good conscience toward God. So these three verses all talk about what I call the mental side of baptism. Faith in the working of God, calling on his name, and the pledge of a clear conscience towards God. It's got to be there, or baptism, frankly, is just getting wet. It's just maybe taking a bath, a rinse. This same idea was something that a really neat guy named Roger Williams came up with. Roger Williams was a Puritan back in the 1600s. He was educated and worked some as a preacher, as a theologian, and some other ways too in England. But he decided he would cast his lot in the New World, so he migrated to the Massachusetts colony that was controlled by the Puritans, by the Puritan Church, and began to work there and live there and preach there. Very productive, dynamic guy, but he got in all kinds of trouble with the Puritans. And then he found it necessary just frankly to flee. He was really very influential in working with the Native Americans, the people we call Indians. He learned a lot of their languages, and they gave him refuge through one winter. And then he went down to what is now Rhode Island, the city of Providence, Rhode Island. The word Providence comes into play there. And he and another guy were responsible for founding the first Baptist church in the whole world. Williams never really considered himself a Baptist per se, but he wrote and spoke very convincingly about this very subject, that people have to have faith if they're going to be baptized. So he was not in favor. He was very much against the practice of infant baptism that was big in the Church of England and with the Puritans. And furthermore, a lot of people had an idea the way to solve the cultural conflict between the Europeans, the people from England and Holland and all these other countries that were coming to the New World, and the Native Americans, the Indians, was to force the Indians to be baptized, to be Christians. They thought, if we can baptize them, they'll be Christians, and then they'll have to do what we tell them to do, and they'll have to live by our standards and so forth and so on. And Roger Williams says, hey, wait a minute, it's not really baptism if you don't have, faith in the working of God, if you're not calling on his name, if it's not the pledge of a good conscience towards God. He wrote a very eloquent book or tract about this very subject. So people have recognized for a long time that scriptural baptism has to involve not only the body, but the mind, the soul, the heart, the whole person. Well, that takes us up to Colossians chapter 3, and I've been telling you all along, heavy theology in chapters 1 and 2. Chapters 3 and 4 are much more down to earth and give us some real important guidelines for daily living as Christians. So let's just read, if you don't mind, that first part there of Colossians chapter 3. It's on the back of on the second page of your handout if you happen to have printed it out. Since then, you have been raised with Christ. Set your hearts on things above, where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. Set your minds on things above, not on earthly things. For you died, and your life is now hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is your life, appears, then you also will appear with him in glory. He starts off, and he's going to give us some real detailed instructions about how we ought to live. But he starts off with the heart, The heart of the matter is a matter of the heart. I'm kind of a football fan, and I'm very, very sad that it looks like our football season is going to be postponed or canceled this year. Who knows? But if you listen to football coaches talk about the defensive players, it's really important for these guys to run really fast, to be really quick, to be able to jump high, and to be very aggressive. But what they always want to talk is not those things. They always want to talk about their eyes, about the players placing their eyes in the right place. And if they don't have their eyes in the right place, looking at the opponent's players or the ball or something, they're not looking at the right part of the field, then boom, the play's over and the other team has scored. So they always emphasize placing your eyes in the right place. Paul, the same way, he talks about where your heart is. He says if you want your behavior to come out right, if you want to live like a disciple, if you want to follow in the steps of Jesus, well, let's start off with where your heart is. And so he says the secret is to have your hearts and minds set on things above. There's a beautiful hymn, Lord of our highest love. And it starts with these words, Lord of our highest love, let now thy peace be given. Fix all our thoughts on things above, our hearts on thee in heaven. And I think it's inspired by this verse here. But really, is this possible? What does it mean to fix your minds on things above? You just go around all the day thinking about the throne room of God and angels? I mean, is that what your mind's supposed to be, just full of the last couple of chapters of Revelation, the great city with the 12 gates and the crystal clear water flowing out from the throne of God, and the 24 elders, casting their crowns down before God all the time? Is that all you're supposed to think about? And most of us would have a hard time making a living if that's all, because we have to spend our time thinking about what it is that we're trying to do with our work. But I think the next phrase is very helpful here. It says, fix your minds or set your hearts on things above, where Christ is seated at the right hand of God. Set your minds on things above, not on earthly things. And so, people had to work they weren't in an 8-hour day or a 40-hour week when he wrote this. People had to work pretty hard back then too. But he's saying if your focus is entirely on earthly things, on the work, the recreation, the endeavors, the politics, the news, if it's all about this life, you're going to have a real hard time getting your behavior to where it needs to be. You need to spend a good bit of your mental energy thinking about spiritual things, thinking about God and his love for you, His will for the world, pondering the great deep truths of Jesus' teaching, struggling with these things, that is setting your heart on things above. So that's the direction I think he wants us to move in. But he doesn't. He definitely doesn't stop there. I guess I should mention on your sheet this idea about it's all about the inner life is one of the main points of Christianity. And it's one way that Jesus kind of pushed back against the teaching of the Jewish religious leaders of his day. He talked about how just getting the ritual right, just getting the form right, just getting the behavior right was not enough. In Mark 7, he was criticized, he and his disciples were criticized for, quote, eating with unwashed hands. Now, it's not talking about COVID or even, just etiquette there. That was something that they did out of a religious ritual, was having a ritual hand washing before they ate. And Jesus said that, the things, it is from within, from a person's heart. That's where evil thoughts come from. Sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, greed, malice, deceit, lewdness, envy, slander, arrogance, and folly. That didn't come off the dirt on your hands. He says that comes from within your heart. And so we've got to clean up our heart if we're going to get our behavior right. Ephesians, which once we get into particularly this part of the book, Ephesians 4 and 5, Colossians 3 and 4, they track so closely together, it's obvious that the same person wrote them about the same time. But the way it's put in Ephesians, you must put off your old self, which is being corrupted in its deceitful desires, to be made new in the attitude of your mind. Your attitude, how important that is. And also this idea of new or renewal. Paul expresses it this way in Romans 12, verse 2. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And so I think this is a kind of a test that we should use for our inner life, our recreation, our renewal. Is this, whatever I'm doing, whatever I'm thinking about, whatever I'm listening to, is it leading me to a spiritual renewal? Is it leading me to a renewing of the attitude of my mind in a way that the Lord would be pleased? There's so much negativity. One person I listen to likes to talk about the culture of death. The culture of death. And even though we have conquered a lot of diseases, maybe not yet COVID, but we've conquered a lot of diseases and our lifespan is getting longer, we have a horrible culture of death. There's abortion and euthanasia and the things that promise life, the sexual immorality that is in fact a culture of death. Violence and warfare and exploitation in so many ways, this produces a culture of death rather than a culture of renewal. This takes us into a section of Colossians that we call a vice list. It's a list of specific sins. The Lord didn't want us to be left wondering what's the difference between right and wrong. So there is a list of specific sins, and we're going to talk about that. But I want you to know that right after that, there's a list of virtues, of good things. And if there's one thing that I think the Bible teaches is that if you want to do better, if you want to be better, if you want to live the life of a disciple, just stopping bad things is not going to get it. You've got, Jesus told this great parable about a house where all these demons were living. And so they cleaned all the demons out. They cleaned the house out. They got all the evil out of the house and left it. So the demons wandered around. They couldn't find any other place to live. So they came back, and they got all their friends to come back with them. And so the moral of the story is the hazard of spiritual emptiness. So as we take the vices out, we bring the virtues in. It's a complete lifestyle change, not a checklist where you do one thing at a time. Put to death, therefore, back to the cemetery, whatever it is that belongs to your earthly nature. sexual immorality, impurity, lust, evil desires, and greed, which is idolatry. Because of these, the wrath of God is coming. You used to walk in these ways in the life you once lived. But now you must also rid yourselves of all such things as these: anger, rage, malice, slander, and filthy language from your lips. Do not lie to each other, since you've taken off your old self and have put on the new self, which is being renewed in knowledge in the image of its creator. In fact, there are quite a few vice lists in the Bible, in the New Testament, for example. And so there's a hyperlink on your sheet to a web page that has about 20 of these lists of specific sins. And frankly, when I read through this list, I do some self-examination, and in some of the areas I get a good grade in. Some of the areas not very good at all, and so you begin to wonder, well, how do I do this? How do I, if I say there's one specific thing I need to really work on here, for example, anger, how am I going to go about this? Just don't be angry. Just use a lot of self-control. And for me, that frankly, that doesn't help much. That doesn't work much. One thing that I think is really helpful is to go back to the teachings of Jesus, specifically in the Sermon on the Mount. In the Sermon on the Mount, as you know, or as you should know, Matthew 5, 6, and 7, it starts off with the Beatitudes, and this is kind of the charter for the disciples' lifestyle. And of course, the first Beatitude is, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." And that particular Beatitude takes some meditation. It takes some thought. It takes some self-examination. Poor in spirit. Whatever poor in spirit, whatever Jesus meant by that, I think it's really antithetical to anger and rage and malice. I think it's helpful, and I've tried to kind of get a start on this on your handout, to group these vices that we read about in Colossians 3, and then go back and reread the Sermon on the Mount and see how it addresses some of these things. For example, if we start off with sexual immorality, impurity, lust, evil desires, if we take that grouping, what does the Sermon on the Mount have to say about that? Well, Jesus talks about, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. They're not dabbling in evil. They're not following the clickbait, if you will. It says, blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. He talks about a man who looks after a woman lustfully has committed adultery with her in his heart. Next, we could take a grouping about greed. It says greed, which is idolatry. I think there's other places in the Bible that identify greed or covetousness with pagan religion, with idolatry, with worshiping something in place of God. We don't talk much about coveting or greed. We talk about materialism some. It's hard for us to see that, maybe they are the same thing. Selfishness, I want it all for me. Jesus said, blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. And if there's a needy person here that needs some help, but I can't spare it, I've got to keep it all to myself, that's greed. So blessed are the poor in spirit, that beatitude really addresses, blessed are the merciful, really addresses this problem of greed. Jesus later in the sermon talks about having treasure in heaven. He says you cannot serve both God and money. You can't serve two masters. Then we come to the grouping anger, rage, and malice. And I've already mentioned the connection with poverty of spirit. He says, blessed are the meek. I don't know exactly what he meant by meek, but I have a hard time seeing a really truly meek person, engaging in anger and rage. He says, blessed are the peacemakers. He talks about turning the other cheek. If someone hits you on one cheek, turn the other cheek to him also. He says, if you're at the altar making an offering and you realize that your brother has something against you, leave your offering there and go and be reconciled to your brother. Contrast that with anger, rage, and malice. And then we get into sins of the tongue. He talks about slander and filthy language. And you see this poverty of spirit, this humility, this desire to be close to God, this emphasis on the spiritual side of life. It's just kind of a thread that runs all the way through. He said, let your yes be yes and your no be no, instead of offering an oath. He said, be a person who is so assiduous about telling the truth, even about your enemies, that you don't slander them. When people hear you say something, you don't have to reinforce it with an oath. They know that you're telling the truth, that you're being fair in your evaluation of the situation. Filthy language, he talks about filthy language, a curse that's directed toward a brother. He uses this word raka, which in his native tongue, Aramaic, meant you fool, you contemptible person. And he says, if you call your brother raka, you're in danger of the punishment of hellfire. He talks about a good tree cannot bear bad fruit. And so it's an overall lifestyle. Still, though, let's go back to the cemetery for a second. Is it realistic to think that we can truly put to death these behaviors, to rid ourselves of these things? And I got to say, my personal experience is that it's a process. It's a process. And while we can show great improvement, the devil is always right there at the door. And sometimes in times and places that we least expected, we disappoint ourselves, we disappoint him, and we stumble. So that's why I'm glad that there is a progressive element in the way that it expresses itself in Colossians. It says here that just give me a second. Verse 10, Colossians 3:10, that's the one we're looking for. You put on the new self, which, now get this, is being renewed in knowledge in the image of its creator. Is being renewed. It's a process. It's a progressive thing. Well, this section down here, verses 9 and 10, talks about not lying to each other. He said, don't lie to each other. You've taken off your old self with its practices and have put on the new self, which is being renewed in the image of its creator. What's the connection between lying and this kind of renewal? Well, first of all, the image of the creator is antithetical to deception. But also the fact that we are all created in God's image, that we are all part of one body, as it says in Ephesians, which presents essentially the same teaching here, then we can't lie to each other. We can't lie to each other. The elements of our body are in such close contact, in such close proximity, that they cannot lie to each other or the body dies. And so this leads us quite naturally into verse 11, where Paul says, here there is no Gentile or Jew, circumcised or uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave or free, but Christ is all and is in all. Something that our world is struggling with tremendously today can be abbreviated as identity politics. And the idea is that there are all these identifiable groups of people out there. And some of them are privileged and some are marginalized. And so what there needs to be is a negotiation among these groups to bring the privileged groups down and bring the marginalized groups up, and to seek a remedy for the marginalized groups. And this has gotten into Christianity and the idea that the white church needs to apologize to the black church for previous injustices and slights and wrongs. Well, first of all, let's just say that there have been plenty of previous injustices, slights, and wrongs. The one thing that's just taught just as clear as a bell here is that racism is a sin. And racism, broadly defined, to include, different ethnic groups, different backgrounds, different even religious roots. That these things are inherently sinful in God's sight. But there's an important contrast between that and what I'm referring to as identity politics, and that's this. There's not to be inside the body some sort of negotiation between the various groups, the various identities. There's only to be one identity. There's only to be one identity. And when you and I become a Christian, we're no longer a white person. We're no longer a Chinese person. We're no longer a black person. And to a certain extent, we're no longer male or female. We're no longer slave or free. We're all Christians. That's the key. We're not a Republican or a Democrat anymore. We're not a progressive or a Marxist or a conservative. Those things have receded into the background. The thing that we are is we're part of Christ. That's our identity. That's the ethnic group we're a part of. Well, you may say that's not realistic. That's the New Testament, the way I'm reading it here. Now, there's some things that are still there. There's some social boundaries that are still there. And Paul says here, neither slave or free. And then he gives some instructions for slaves in chapter 4. We'll have to wrestle on that one together. That's not an easy question to answer, and we've already wrestled with it some in the book of Philemon, which was, accompanied this book of Colossians. So I want to encourage you to continue this study with me. I'm going to pray for you this week, and I hope you'll pray for me too. We love you very much and love your hearts for being committed to this study. You sure don't want to stop now. This study of vices can be a little bit of a downer. Next week we'll get into the virtues. God bless you this week.